Although you don't exactly see a huge amount of Lincoln Navigators here in the UK, it still begs the question for those who are perhaps interested in potentially buying one or owning one. Maybe, for example, you're considering it as a family 4x4, you've spotted one maybe on eBay or Facebook Marketplace, and you're between this and maybe something more conventional like a Range Rover Sport or an Audi Q7, maybe even some of its rivals like a Hummer H2 or a Cadillac Escalade. Is this worth considering instead of those? And of course, as an extension of that, what are cars like this, and more specifically a Navigator, like to actually live with? Well, I'm in a prime position to answer those questions because this, of course, is my vehicle. This is my current daily driver, and to be honest, you can kind of sum up this entire video within one or two sentences by saying that for the moment, I have no plan to change this car. If you're interested in this kind of car, I think the Navigator provides pretty much everything you're going to want from it. Because talking about it compared to Q7s and Range Rovers and whatever else, of course that all does have validity, especially here in the UK. First things first though, we need to compare it to its main rivals on the used market. Those two main rivals, I would argue, are the Cadillac Escalade, which of course is its primary rival, but also potentially something like a Hummer H2. And by extension, you could even say maybe like a Ford F150, perhaps a GMC Yukon, a Chevy Suburban, and of course many of these share the same platform. Speaking of sharing the same platform, the Lincoln Navigator itself is based on the same engine for the most part, the same platform for the most part as the Ford F series, so like the F150, and of course the Ford Expedition. You'll even find a few of those in the UK, and they tend to be even cheaper. Navigators are a classier version. It's essentially like if you compare, a Lexus to a Toyota. You'll get a lot of the same kind of fantastic reliability, build quality, practicality, but the Lexus is just that little bit higher on the totem pole in terms of what you get, the kind of luxury feel which the car has, if you will. And of course, everyone and their mum has an offshooting brand, it would seem these days, like Genesis, Infiniti, various others as well. But Lexus was one of the ones to really make that work. And in a funny kind of way, Lincoln was one of the very first to make it work because they were themselves the luxury side, if you will, of Ford. Much like Bentley here in the UK though, always overshadowed by America's Rolls-Royce equivalent, which was of course Cadillac. In the modern age, I would argue that Lincoln is not really Bentley anymore, any more than Cadillac is Rolls-Royce. Cadillac is more like Mercedes-AMG these days, and Lincoln is more like Jaguar, or at least pre-electrified bright pink Jaguar. The one crucial thing I will say in terms of swaying you either way compared to something like an Escalade or a Hummer H2, because for full exposure, I have not owned a Hummer. I did actually consider a H2 when I was purchasing this one, but I just cannot justify doing 10 to the gallon from my daily driver because that's exactly what this car is, my daily, so of course we'll return to the point of fuel economy in a second, but comparing it to an Escalade is pretty valid, because for those who don't know, I used to have one of those as well. In fact, within the past couple of years, I had a 2011 era Escalade, and it was the ESV version as well, the stretched version with still 7 seats, but an even bigger boot on the back as well. In terms of height and width, there's not too much between them. Of course, this is technically an older vehicle to what that Escalade would have been. This one is one of only about 60 Lincoln Navigators in total in all of the UK from any model year, one of only 8 from 2005, and one of only 6 in black. So if you do see a black Navigator on the road, there's a 1 in 6 chance that it could be me, and I am considering putting my private plate on it, so that will narrow it down even more. Narrowing it down even more though is the fact that this is a Navigator limited edition. This one, for example, also has the 20-inch factory wheels instead of typically 18s. It's quite comical that they're 20-inch because they still look tiny because the car is so big. And speaking of the size of the car, that is one of the biggest gripes which people could potentially have with a big American car, so I'm here to dispel that myth first. The biggest issue which a new driver to one of these will have is the fact that you're immediately sitting on the left instead of the right. Many people ask me what that's like because for full exposure, I have 3 cars at the moment, all American, all V8, and all left-hand drive. I actually prefer left-hand drive, and one of the reasons why is because of overtaking. These days, especially on built-up roads around the UK, which is most roads these days, you have so many cars parked down the left side where you're driving that with a left-hand drive car, I can get so close to those parked cars when necessary to overtake. It also means that as long as I know where the left-hand side of the road is, the white line, the curb, whatever, I know that for a fact, people on the other side or in the next lane to me on a dual carriageway or the motorway have more than enough space. The reason why we can also say that is because the actual physical size of this Navigator isn't as crazy as you would think. It's a fraction over 80 inches wide, so it's not small by any stretch. You are still looking down on Range Rovers and Q7s, so it is a very big car. It's 78 inches tall, but in terms of length, that is the crucial difference between this and my Escalade. Of course, being an ESV and a later generation ESV, it's not an entirely fair comparison, but that was something like 223 inches long. This is 207. In fact, as crazy as it sounds, this is still the shortest of my 3 cars. It's a full foot shorter than my Lincoln Continental. Another thing which you would expect is a massive amount of weight. weight. But again, it's not as heavy as you might think, especially in comparison to a lot of other vehicles. And I think one of the reasons why is actually one of the best things about this car. It's fairly simple. Now, of course, by American standards, they're full of tech. You've got the power opening and closing tail, the power side sills. In fact, those side sills were, unless I'm mistaken, the first in the business to do that before, Range Rover and everyone else was doing the same. And it's actually quite funny because when I take this to meets and shows, or even just have passengers, they're always fascinated by the side sills. I guess because I spend a lot of time working around Range Rovers and stuff, I'm not too enthused by that because they all do it. But I guess on a 20-year-old car such as this one, it is quite a novel idea. The point that I'm making is, though, by American standards, they do have a lot of electrical systems. And it does tend to be very Maserati style, those electrical systems which will have gremlins. Scanning your car, fixing something on your car, replacing something on the car will be electrical. You won't be replacing as many mechanical things, and of course it depends on how the car's been treated, servicing, all that kind of stuff. And unfortunately, because Lincoln has never really had much of a footprint here in the UK, unlike, ironically, Cadillac, who tried to sell cars for a while, and I believe they still are, there's only like one officially recognised Cadillac servicing location in the UK, but there are none for Lincoln, so you pretty much have to get it serviced by whoever you trust. Some kind of American specialist maybe, 4x4 specialist. For me, I'm just going to go with that kind of deal. So in terms of servicing, as long as you know that the right work has been done, who really cares about a stamp? Part of the reason why you don't need to care about the stamp is because these cars don't attract a huge amount of value anyway, which is great. That's always been one of the reasons why I love Lincoln. They're always overshadowed by Cadillac, and to some degree by Hummer in this case, and it means that those cars, simply put, tend to cost more. For the equivalent Cadillac, you're talking probably $2-3 grand more quite easily, unless there's something wrong with the Escalade, and in the case of a Hummer, well, at least $3 to $5 grand more, 15-16 grand at least for a decent Hummer H2. There was one on eBay at the time of making this video in black. It's come over from Dubai with over 100,000 miles on it, and even that's near enough 11 grand. This in comparison, well, this car's got 97,000 on the clock. I've just passed 98,000, so certainly not crazy high for a 20-year-old vehicle, and yet I paid 7 grand for it. That is an insane amount of car for the money, especially as we get further into its spec. But here's the thing, that is not an unusual price for this car at all. In fact, at the time of, again, releasing this video, there's another one for sale. I believe it was on Auto Trader. The problem therein of these not having any kind of intrinsic value in the UK is highlighted here because it's also about 7 grand, except that car has about 300,000 miles on it. So there is no consensus in terms of what these cars should cost, which is one of the downsides of trying to find a good one. You certainly can. And the great thing is, you really don't need to budget for any more than 10 grand to buy a Navigator. In terms of the history of this platform, it debuted in 1998. Of course, stuff like the Jeep Wagoneer had already been around for a while and kind of inspired, let's say, a number of these other brands to try their hand at a kind of luxury utility vehicle or a luxury truck, if you will. And of course, Cadillac tended to do that a bit more often than Lincoln in the truck side of things with the EXT versions of the Escalade. Lincoln did kind of make their version of that with the extremely rare and not very successful Lincoln Blackwood, which is a dubiously styled vehicle, in my opinion, based on a first-generation Navigator, and the much more impressive looking and very obviously F150 based Lincoln Mark LT, which is a pretty naff name, to be honest. They should have just called it the Blackwood again, but that's actually a pretty decent looking truck. Again, you really do not see many of those though, and there's a later version which has a distinctly more nasal, almost I would say kind of Pontiac sort of appearance to it. From 1998 up until about 2009, these were all manufactured in Wayne, Michigan, and in terms of the platform, as we already said, it does share most of it with the Ford Expedition, and a decent amount as well, including the engine, albeit with a different head, to Ford's own F150. And in most cases here in the UK, you're looking at the 5.4 V8 in either double overhead cam or single overhead cam form. Sometimes called the Intech engine, sometimes called the Triton engine, all depends on the variation, all depends on whether or not they decided to name it that, it would seem some of the time. And now that we're discussing the point of the engine, this is another thing which I want to touch on, comparing it to the Escalade, because in my opinion it's more impressive. The Escalade was a very impressive bit of kit, but one of the things I never liked about it is the displacement on demand, if you will, the cylinder shutdown tech. So in the case of the Cadillac, it was a 6.2 V8 with about 410 horsepower, but unless you really put your foot down, you're actually driving on half of the engine. So it was more like a 3.1 V4 with about, I guess, 200-ish horsepower, even in that condition. And despite weighing about the same as this car, I used to average about 15, which even so by American standards isn't bad, and when you again compare that to a Hummer with essentially the same GM engine underneath as an Escalade but significantly worse aerodynamics and even higher weight at just under 3 tons, well, those do about 10 to the gallon. I'm averaging about 16, 17 to the gallon even with a full-time 5.4, which to me is just more impressive, and even though the engine isn't as powerful and isn't quite as torquey, it's not far off, and trust me when I say that this car definitely isn't slow when it comes to daily driving. On paper it's 8 seconds to 60, which doesn't sound that good these days, but when you put that into perspective, especially around 2005, that's barely 0.2 of a second behind a V10 Touareg, which ain't bad at all, especially given that this car has nowhere near the torque of something like that diesel V10. It's still a very decent 360 or so foot-pounds with 300 horsepower, so again it seems very modest, but here's another fun thing about it. Because it's that F150 based unit, a little known company that some of you may have heard of called Cayenne happened to be quite adept at tuning that engine, and it's essentially the same engine that you can find in my favourite truck of them all, the Cayenne S331 Supercab. That, with basically just a change of exhaust, airbox, and of course a big old twin screw supercharger, puts the power up from 300 to immediately 450, and the torque from 360 foot-pounds to 500, which is about 700 newtons. Especially ironically for a truck, is, as far as I'm aware, only available with rear-wheel drive. So yeah, it's powerful, but you're going to wheel spin a hell of a lot. In the case of these Navigators, much like the Escalade, there are some that are rear-wheel drive and some that are four-wheel drive. Now, I'm not going to say in all cases because I could be wrong, but at least in the case of mine, which of course is a second generation car from 2005, and this was basically the midpoint facelift. It went from the kind of chunkier, more plastic front end with smaller fog lights, if you will, to these squarer units, and in my opinion a more handsome, classier looking front end. To go back to the point of being rear-wheel drive or four-wheel drive though, in the case of this one, it's yet another thing which I think is so much better than the Escalade. Of course, my Escalade was technically the later generation equivalent, more like a third gen Escalade, whereas this is a second gen Navigator. In the case of rear-wheel drive versus two-wheel drive, the Cadillac, as far as I can recall, pretty much had like an automatic switch system where it detected if you needed it or not, kind of like a Volkswagen 4Motion style with a Golf R32. Well, this one literally just has a Mitsubishi L200 style switch where you can go between rear-wheel drive high ratio, four-wheel drive high ratio, and four-wheel drive low ratio just with one switch on the dash right next to the steering wheel. That is driver control. It's to the point and it does exactly what you want when you want it. And of course, being based on a truck, you would hope for some decent towing capacity, let's say, and that they certainly do. Ironically, you can actually tow more with the rear-wheel drive versions, so in my case I don't really care. Mine does have a tow hitch, but it's not really my thing. I've never towed anything with any of my cars, and with this kind of space I rarely need to anyway, but you can incidentally tow up to about 8,000 pounds with one of these, which is over 3.7 tons, just under 4 tons in the case of the rear-wheel drive, so a hell of a lot of pulling power. And in terms of the weight of the vehicle itself, well, the rear-wheel drive version is a bit lighter, as you would assume, 2.6 tons to 2.7 tons on the four-wheel drive, but curiously, this one, like mine, if you can find around a 2005, is actually a bit lighter. I think that's partially due to the uprated gearbox, which we'll touch on in a second. It's 2,520 kilos, so 2.5 tons, or 2,650 in the case of this four-wheel drive version. 5,500 pounds or 5,800 pounds, respectively, which once again isn't really that crazy for a vehicle of its size, and trust me, this thing dwarfs Porsche Cayennes, Touaregs. It is a giant car compared to most on the road in the UK, and yet still isn't as big as a H2 or an Escalade. Well, as I said earlier on, it's more than big enough and still has a surprisingly modest weight for, let's just say, a full-size 7-seater, that's for sure. In terms of the seating layout, it's very Escalade style, and some do seem to vary. Some have like a conventional second row, some I think have like 2 at the back. This particular one is exactly the same as my Cadillac, which is 2 in the front, 2 behind, and then 3 in the third row. I seem to recall that my Escalade had manual flip-forward seats. You could check the video and see if I'm right or wrong though. This one in comparison has the quite nice touch of a fully motorised third row, which of course on the one hand is something which could potentially break, and that is always the downside, but for now at least it works, and you can fold it flat into the floor for fantastic loading room. Of course then making it a 4-seater, but still you've got the option therein, and you can also fold down the second row as well. In terms of accessories and ease of life stuff, it's got everything you would expect, basically, certainly everything you'd want from the equivalent Range Rover. It's got cruise control, self-leveling air suspension, load leveling as well, of course, towing capacity we've already touched on. The lights are more than powerful enough, even by modern standards. You've got the sunroof in the case of mine, fully powered windows, of course. It's got the power tailgate and the opening glass hatch as well if you don't want to open the whole boot. So basically everything you would want and expect. One of the design touches about these cars, which I'm a huge fan of, and some of you with the Lincoln aficionado gene, such as myself, might have noticed, is particularly particularly the front dash, is directly inspired by Lincoln's roots, especially around the JFK era of the 1961 kind of style Continentals with the double dash. It's something which some of the Mustangs have as well, where the pod, if you will, around the speedo, etc. of the driver is almost mirrored on the passenger side, which is ironic because it looks like it's ready to be a right-hand drive car as well, but they never actually did that. And you've got that nice little analog clock in the center, kind of like Maserati does in their own thing as well. It's a clean, classy, simple, kind of chunky looking interior. America is of course often critiqued for its interior style, but I will actually say that especially for the early 2000s, the Navigator has aged a lot better than most. In fact, I would argue that if you compare this to, for example, most of the 2000s German interiors from Beamer, Audi, Mercedes, even in the Chrysler era, they really don't compare very well. Going back to the point of suspension, it is of course air, and as I've said before, basically every car ever made with air suspension seems to have an issue with it at some point, and I know that some owners have opted to, interestingly, swap out the air if it ever does have a problem and just put on conventional coil springs with dampers. And there's no real reason why not. I mean, it is a truck in its underpinnings at the end of the day, so you could justifiably do that. For me, I'm just going to run it with the air, keep an eye on them, see how they go. I personally love how they work. In the Touareg, for example, you have the option of raising or lowering it. You do in Range Rovers as well, at least in the newer ones. I don't really want or need that, to be honest, because this car would look really stupid if it was super jacked up. It just doesn't suit the vibe. And in terms of lowering it, well, why would I need to? It does lower itself when parked, especially over the front end. And of course, far up the car, you can hear the pump going, raising it up to the driving height, which adds even more to the feeling of owning the road, which driving this thing gives you. You do feel kind of like you're looking down on houses in this car. And of course, one of the most common questions I do get asked is, how comfortable is this thing? Well, extremely. And although it was a couple of years ago when I had the Escalade, I don't recall really the Escalade being shockingly comfortable. I think it was comfortable, but I don't recall it rivaling, for example, my Continental. This, well, it does. It genuinely rivals either of my other classic American cars, which are known for their comfort. So I would say the ride is very, very good. And even in terms of handling, it's heavy, it's tall. There are warnings on the sun visor about not making dramatic maneuvers because of the higher center of gravity, which I think is kind of like those California cancer warnings where they have to put that on there. But to me, I would say this handles at least as well as you would want a vehicle like this to. And at the end of the day, it's a Lincoln. It's not a performance car. In fact, Lincoln don't really do performance cars for the most part. And the one time that they kind of were thinking about that was ironically with one of these. They made the very unappealingly named Navigator K concept because they'd heard rumblings of Cadillac making a V12 version of the Escalade, which of course never happened, but they were kind of rushing through thinking they needed a rival, so they basically dropped an F150 SVT Lightning engine into one of these, which is a cool idea. It looked basically the same as the others, just with bigger rims, which is a bit boring. The one last thing which I definitely want to touch on, because it's quite fascinating, and certainly an improvement in terms of efficiency, is, as I alluded to earlier on, the transmission, or the gearbox as we'd refer to it here in the UK. The older models, up until I believe it was something like 2004 or so, had a 4-speed. Then, from around 2005 onward, including this one, it has a ZF unit, a 6-speed gearbox. It's also really weird to me to get into a car like this and start reaching for the column shifter that I'm so used to. This one has a much more conventional center-mounted unit. If you have owned a Jaguar XK, or a Maserati Quattroporte, or a BMW 6 Series, or a Rolls-Royce Phantom, or any other number of cars in that kind of sphere, you've already driven this gearbox, because it's a 6HP26, which is the exact same gearbox as so many of these other cars that I've already had. And you've got to think, if it's good enough for Rolls-Royce, Jaguar, Maserati, well, I would say that's probably a pretty damn good choice of gearbox. In terms of servicing, it is unfortunately one of those gearboxes which is kind of known as a quote-unquote lifelong unit. There's no such thing as lifelong, so of course you will eventually want to be changing the fluid, but changing out your transmission fluid, much like your engine oil, it's always a good thing to be doing anyway. Not necessarily quite as often as your engine, of course, but still, it is one of those things which I think a lot of people do overlook, which brings me to the final thing: costs. Yes, you can buy it for $7,000, but I mean, you could buy a Range Rover for $7,000. Hell, you could buy a Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow, as I well know. That doesn't mean it's a good idea. So the real clinching question is, what is this like to live with? Am I enjoying it? And what have been the costs incurred so far? Well, as I mentioned earlier on, I unfortunately cannot tell you an exact dealer servicing price because there isn't one in the UK. So basically just find a place that does good quality servicing that you trust, and that's whatever the price is you're going to pay pretty much. So I would imagine probably what, 300, 400, 500 quid for a major service maybe? I don't never know. Depends what they're going to do for you. In my case, I tend to use Rock Auto, which of course is very well known to any of my fellow Yank enthusiasts here in the UK. In fact, you can get plenty more than just American stuff on there. They have incredibly quick shipping, even from America. They prepay your import taxes as well, which is fantastic. And although it sounds like I'm not sponsored by them or anything in any way, all this is to say though that I ordered 10 litres of engine oil, an engine oil filter, a new sump gasket, about 10 litres of transmission fluid. I even managed to find a brand new paperback Haynes manual, believe it or not, covering this car as well. It's technically more so for the Ford, but it is also listed as covering the Navigator, and it certainly does. All of that stuff, including shipping, and it was here within, I think it was like a week or two, tops in a couple of different shipments, was 200 quid. That's like 9/10 of a major servicing kit. I'm still going to pick up some new spark plugs as well to change those out because I forgot to do that at the time, but the costs are insanely low for a car like this, and part of the reason why is fairly obvious. In the UK, these are very rare. As I said, one of 6 in this exact spec, one of 60 in total from every model year over here. In America, well, there are millions of vehicles like this, so for them this would be the equivalent of like ordering a servicing kit for a Ford Focus. It's easy, there's loads of them. Any vehicle can have its problems. Of course, my particular car has also had an LPG conversion in the past, so I can run it on petrol or gas. Gas is cheaper, but it burns through it quicker. It does wear your engine differently as well. I believe it's the valves, if I recall correctly, so I doubt that I'll use it much. I actually run the car exclusively on premium, and it's better for your car anyway if you can. And incidentally, on the point of fuel and taxes, you might be worried about the kind of road tax and, you know, city driving, ULEZ, all that kind of stuff. Well, that really is the hilarious cherry on the cake, because just like my classic big block V8 monsters, this is ULEZ exempt because of the fact that it's an import as well. In the case of mine, it's come from Japan, so of course fantastic in terms of underbody condition. It means you've got basically half or less of the yearly road tax. A 2005-ish kind of Range Rover, especially the equivalent one, which would be the 4.2 supercharged V8, you're talking like £800 a year to tax. This, I paid £360. Slap on the cruise control, or to be honest, you don't even have to. It has electronically adjustable pedals as well. Just get it where you want it, put your foot on, and you get in about 21-ish, maybe 22 to the gallon, which again, given that this is not using cylinder shutdown, whereas the Cadillac is, I find that all the more impressive. That's it for my insights on what it's like to live with a Lincoln Navigator, though. It's definitely one which I would recommend so far. Of course, anything can change, and that will immediately change your opinion on a car. But as I've said before, literally any car ever made can and will break at some point, even a Toyota. All cars are made by people, people are fallible, and everything wears out eventually, whether you take care of it or not. For my money, this is a massive amount of car for £7,000, not just physically speaking, but in terms of road presence, in terms of the conversations, in terms of the people double taking and pointing and giving the thumbs up at it. People genuinely love seeing this car on the road. Some people, you can tell, don't know what it is. Some people probably assume it's a Cadillac. Some might even assume it's a Hummer. You never know over here. And more than a few semi-annoyed / envious looks from people in Q7s, Range Rovers and various other 4x4s here in the UK market who are looking decidedly upward to catch this car's gaze. I hope this video was informative and potentially helpful for those who are considering a Navigator. I would love to hear the kind of warnings, advice, stories, etc. which you would give to not only myself in terms of what to expect, but also of course other people here in the UK who might want one. I would definitely also recommend checking out my review of my Cadillac Escalade, and until next time I'll see you then. But for now, thanks for watching.